All right. Thank you very much. Our apologies. Voting is always fun at this time of the year. Welcome everybody to meeting 119 of the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology as we continue our fascinating, in-depth view of the Copyright Act. Thank you very much. We have with us today from the Professional Writers Association of Canada, Christine Peets, President, and from the Canadian Council of Archives, Nancy Morelli, Special Advisor, Copyright. Before we begin, Mr. General, you had something you wanted to say?
Yes. No. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize to the witnesses here for the few moments that this will take, but do want to take the opportunity to, because of the exceptional circumstances that I believe we find ourselves in. I'm sure when the witnesses booked their travel a few weeks ago, they weren't anticipating that there would have been a pipeline purchased by the government at this point in time. So do want to take the opportunity to move the motion that we have put on the ordered paper last Tuesday. And the motion reads, if I may, Mr. Chair, that the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology undertake a study of 4 meetings to review, among other things, the overall cost of buying and expanding the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, the costs related to oversight, Crown Corporation of the project, and how this decision will impact investors' confidence in Canadian resource projects, and that the committee report the findings back to the House and make recommendations on how to restore investor confidence. I believe, again, it's imperative at this point in time, with the uncertainty in the energy sector created by the situation that the Prime Minister has and the Finance Minister have unfortunately put us in, that this be something that we undertake urgently. So we have that study before us, and we're able to advise the House of Commons appropriately.
Thank you very much. Mr. Graham and then Mr. Bayliss.
I'm just not really clear that it's really relevant to having the witnesses here at this time if you want to bring it up. I think it's quite rude to the witnesses, and I'm not so down to that right now.
Mr. Bayliss?
I move that we adjourn debate.
Debate will be adjourned, and we will move forward. Okay.
Given that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to move my motion.
Okay.
Then, if we are going to simply do that type of a tactic, I will move my motion, which I have tabled in the committee here.
May I jump in? As we talked about earlier, if you want after the witnesses, you can move your motion at that time. So we're not wasting the witnesses' time. We have agreed to allow that out of camera so that you can move it in public. And then we can actually debate it. But it's your call.
Well, do we have to vote on the, I guess I'm procedurally here is where I'm, so, because we can't talk about his motion now, it's where.
Sorry, we have to vote on the motion to adjourn. Yeah.
Record the vote. Thank you.
Okay.
And that's kind of where I was coming from.
My apologies.
That's all good.
So, Mr. Bernier. Mr. Généraux.
Yay.
Mr. Lloyd.
Favor.
Mr. Mass.
Yes.
Point of order. Are we voting on my motion
To adjourn debate, yes.
They're all in favor of it? That's
No,
good to know.
no.
Well, they just said it, so they're all in favor of my motion. No, you just.
Stop.
Motion to
Adjourn the debate. Non-debatable. Non-debatable, it's just a vote, so.
OK. Monsieur Bernier.
On vote sur quoi, là?
Sur la motion pour...
What is it we're voting on? The motion to adjourn the debate.
No. Mr. Lloyd.
It has to be clear.
Mr. Mass?
No.
OK. So, Mr. Bayliss.
In favor.
Mr. Jawari.
In favor.
Mr. Graham?
Yes.
Mrs. Ng?
Yes.
Mr. Lamitzi? Oh, no,
No.
sorry. Sorry, my mistake.
Oh,
So,
look at
we're
that.
at 4-4. So it's...
Yeah, it's the chair. For me, the chair was going to recognize that we do have witnesses here. We. Okay. On that note, thank you very much. Mr. Massey, can we move forward?
Yeah, we can move forward.
Okay, thank you. To our witnesses, we're going to start off with Christine Peets. You have up to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you as you undertake this very important task. I am here on behalf of the Professional Writers Association of Canada, known as PWAC. Our organization represents more than 300 writers, nonfiction writers from coast to coast to coast. Copyright is an extremely important issue to us as it affects our members' income and the respect that should be accorded us. We earn our living through our writing and can only do so successfully when royalties are paid because we own the copyright. When we lose the right to claim the work as our own, income and respect are eroded. Each year, PWAC members receive a repertoire payment as creator affiliates of Access Copyright, an organization that PWAC helped found. In the past 15 years, I have seen my payment diminish from several $100s to less than $100 annually. Payments are based on the amount of work I report for the period being reviewed, which has fluctuated in part due to the fact that there are fewer print publications in Canada. Those that remain often have onerous contracts. Many publishers have instituted contracts giving almost all rights to the company and none or very few to the writer. This is common with our members. Here is a concrete personal example. In 2009, I was presented with a contract to continue writing for a publication that had employed me since 2004. I reluctantly signed the contract, but not before questioning it. I was being asked to give up all rights to material I had written. My client wanted certainty I wouldn't be able to sue them if or when they reused my writing. Is this fair? The company claimed it now needed to secure these rights because of what became known as the Heather Robertson case, a class action suit launched in 1996. Ms. Robertson was the plaintiff against several major media outlets that reprinted her work electronically without permission or payment. Other writers were similarly affected. The case was finally settled after 13 years. There have been similar lawsuits in the United States, and there very well could be another one in Canada. Should freelancers have to engage in lengthy and expensive lawsuits against media outlets in order to protect their copyright and income? Contract issues may be beyond the scope of this committee, but I hope this helps to illustrate the importance of protecting our copyright. As PWAC member Connie Proto wrote to me, it is important that our creative professionalism continues to be respected and appreciated by fellow Canadians who read and learn from our works. We need strong copyright laws to protect works that are available in print format. To that, I add, we need strong copyright laws to protect all work, whether in print or electronic format. If writers are not fairly compensated and properly respected for their work, they will produce less work. Why would anyone continue to work without income or respect for the work? This could have a significant impact on the Canadian material available to Canadian readers, who may then look increasingly to other countries for their information. Ultimately, it could affect the quality of work being published and perhaps the viability of our publishing industry. Canada needs a strong writing and publishing sector that contributes to the economy by providing both personal and corporate incomes that increase tax revenues. Ontario PWAC member Michael Fay reminded me that our association and other writers' organizations played a critical role in the 2012 review of the Copyright Act, when copying restrictions and procedures were set. It is important to remember not only the user, but their creator with this current review. Another PWAC member from Ontario, Laurie Strauss, put it this way: people copy creative work because it speaks to them and because it's easy to do. It's much harder to copy a Kit Kat. The effort wouldn't be worth it. Finally, I would like to share with you another perspective brought forward by BC PWAC member Rhonda Payne, in which she draws an interesting comparison. She wrote, "No one debates who built a building or tries to usurp its ownership. What makes it acceptable to do so with the written word? It's not. We put just as much effort into writing as the architect, the contractor, or the building owner put into their work. When the building owner allows others to use his space, he is paid in the form of a rent or a lease, or the sale of the building. As writers, we should be afforded the same recognition of our ownership and rights. When someone takes our work without even considering payment to the creator, it's the equivalent of squatting in a building. I want people to appreciate my work, but I also want to be compensated for it. I deserve to be paid for the work I do. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to move to Nancy Morelli. You have up to 7 minutes.
Thank you. The Canadian Council of Archives, the Conseil Canadien des Archives, the CCA, is a national non-profit organization representing more than 800 archives across the country. Membership includes provincial and territorial councils across Canada, the Association des Archivistes du Québec, and the Association of Canadian Archivists. I want to talk first about technological protection measures, or TPMs. Provisions introduced in 2012 prohibit the circumvention of technological protection measures, TPMs, or digital locks. Even for non-infringing purposes, such as preservation activities used by archivists to protect our holdings. This draconian measure is of grave concern in the digital environment, where obsolescence is both rapid and disastrous for long-term access. And of course, long-term access is what archives are all about. Let me give you a fictional example of this problem. An archives holds a copy of a CD on the history of a small company that built birch bark canoes for over 150 years. It was the main industry in the town that grew around the factory. The CD was created by a group that came together briefly in 1985 as the company closed down. The only existing CD was deposited by the last surviving family member of the owners, and it includes photographs, oral history interviews, catalogs, and film footage, the kinds of materials that you standard find in archives. The group disbanded after fire destroyed its office and all the original material it had collected. So the original material has disappeared. All you have left is the CD. And as the CD approaches obsolescence, the archives wishes to ensure the contents are preserved for posterity. But the CD is protected with a digital lock, and the archives cannot locate the creators and cannot circumvent the digital lock to preserve this unique material. As the CD becomes obsolete and the files become unreadable, we'll lose this important part of our documentary history. We recommend that the Copyright Act be amended so circumvention of TPMs is permitted for any activity that is otherwise allowable under the Act. Archives are allowed to circumvent, or are allowed to reformat materials and reproduce them if they are in an obsolete or about to become obsolete format. But we're not allowed to use that exception if you have to circumvent a digital lock in order to do so. I want to talk a little bit about Crown copyright. Crown works are works prepared or published by or under the direction or control of Her Majesty or any federal, provincial, or territorial government department. Copyrighting Crown works never expires unless the work is published, in which case the work is protected for 50 years from the date of the first publication. Canadian archives hold millions of unpublished Crown works of historical interest, including correspondence, reports, studies, photographs, surveys, all kinds of works. We've been promised changes to Crown copyright for decades and decades and decades. Crown copyright provisions, as they stand now, do not serve the public interest in the digital age. They're long overdue for a comprehensive overhaul. We recommend that the Act be amended immediately so the term of protection for Crown works is 50 years from the date of creation, whether or not the works are published. We further recommend that there be a comprehensive study to identify problem issues, consult with stakeholders, and recommend solutions that serve the public interest in the digital age. We need to change these rules. I want to talk a little bit about reversion, which is a not very well-known provision in the Copyright Act. When transferring historical materials to archives, many donors assign the copyrights they hold in those materials to the archives. Section 14.1 of the Copyright Act, reversion, is a little-known relic inherited from the 1911 British Act. It provides that where an author who is the first owner of copyright in a work has assigned that copyright, other than by will, to another party, and I can give as an example here, a contract to an archival repository, the ownership of the copyright will revert back to the author's estate 25 years after his or her death, and the estate will own the copyright for the remaining 25 years of the copyright term, and this provision cannot be overridden by additional contract terms. It's clearly undue interference in the freedom of an author to enter into a contract, and it's an administrative nightmare for archival institutions and for donor estates. It's just one of those things that's there, and people are not even aware of it. We recommend that Section 14.1 be repealed, or at the very least, that it be amended to permit the author to assign the reversionary interest by contract, which is not currently allowed. Indigenous knowledge, and it's a bit of a landmark day after yesterday's vote on the UNDRIP provisions. Canadian archivists are concerned about copyright protection of Indigenous knowledge and cultural expressions, stories, songs, names, dances, ceremonies in any format. And we have all of these kinds of materials in Canadian archives. The foundational principles of copyright legislation are that copyright is owned by an author for a term based on the author's life. But in the Indigenous approach, there is ongoing community ownership of creations. Archivists are committed to working with Indigenous communities to provide appropriate protection and access to the Indigenous knowledge in our holdings, while at the same time ensuring the traditional protocols, concerns, and wishes of Indigenous peoples are addressed. We urge the federal government to engage in a rigorous, respectful, and transparent collaboration with Canada's Indigenous peoples to amend the Copyright Act to recognize a community-based approach. And the archives community will very happily participate in this process. We're eager, in fact, to do so. This is an issue which we believe needs to be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to go right into questioning with Mr. Bayless. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I won't be moving a motion, just... Ms. Peets, you brought up something that we haven't heard before. We have heard a lot about the writers seeing their income going down, but you brought up a point about some challenges between the writers and the publishers.
Yes.
And you felt that there's an imbalance there, and is that part of what is chewing into your income? These contracts that they said they force you to sign?
Yes, it does, because I can only claim work to which I still own copyright for my access copyright payment, for example. So if the publisher has taken all of the copyright and the moral rights, then I no longer have the right to that material. So therefore, I cannot put it into my repertoire for my access copyright payment.
What would you like to see the government do about that?
That's why I said that I think the contracts are beyond the scope of this committee, but what could be done is to strengthen the copyright laws so that publishers no longer can ask for those rights, that those rights remain with the author.
That might sound like a good idea today, but would it not add something like Ms. Nancy brought up, like causing problems for someone that may wish to do it and cannot do it? Would you have something to add to that, Ms. Morelli?
I wouldn't dare to comment on the writers' issues. I think that she's better placed to.
The idea, if you were, as an archivist or someone wanted to purchase all their rights, and we were to do what you're asking, write a law that you can't sell all your rights, would that not impact your ability?
Certainly, in terms of archival matters, when something is deposited into an archives, knowing the actual status of the copyright is very, very important, and that's why it becomes an issue. So that's where the contractual agreements
Right.
definitely come in. And the contractual agreements any creator has have to be part of their archival deposit.
I'm more questioning, and I'll go back to you, Ms. Peets. If we were to say that you cannot sell your rights to a publisher and someone wants to, I don't see how that could work, to be honest.
I'm not saying that the writer can't sell the rights to the publisher should they wish to, or can't enter into any other kind of contract with their right. What I'm asking is to make sure that the right to do with as they wish with their work remains with the creator.
But if I understand, and maybe you could elucidate me here, your publisher said, this is a deal that I'm forcing on you. You could have said, I don't want the deal, right? They did.
Yes.
But if you said you don't want the deal, then you lose your publisher.
Yes,
So they strong-armed you.
basically.
But I still am at a loss to see what recommendation you'd like us to do in the Copyright Act to stop them from strong-arming you, because they have an imbalance of power, I get that, but
Yeah. I wish I could say that this could be legislated, but I don't think it can be. The only thing is to make the copyright laws strong enough so that the publisher wouldn't then think that they can ask for that right. I think the way it's written now, it's perhaps a little weaker, and that's why the publishers have looked at that and said that, yes, we want all of these rights. And if the copyright laws are strengthened to, so that the publishers wouldn't look at that and ask for those rights. And I don't know what else you could do.
okay, thank you. I'll move on to Ms. Morelli about the question of Crown copyright. And on this topic here, if it becomes readily available, it's one thing, and you're saying that if it's not published, it never becomes available after 50 years. How would you know about it then? Did you want access to it that's not published? How do you know it exists?
Well, that's one of the issues, is that in archives, we certainly increasingly want to make materials available digitally. So we have materials, we have a lot of these materials in the archives, but, people come to our reading rooms, but where people want to access archival materials now is on the internet.
But you're
So
saying you cannot put the Crown copyright
we have
on?
to get permissions, and in fact, recently, the government has changed the way permissions for Crown copyright have come about. And it's devolved not to a single centralized source, but to the source, the departmental source of where the material was created.
So you have this Crown copyright in your archive.
Yeah.
Someone comes along and says, I'd like to access it, and it's a big to-do for you. Because you've got-
You can access it
if they
in our reading rooms.
If they physically come.
Exactly.
But if they don't physically show up, you're effectively making a copy, is that it, or you're?
We want to digitize a lot of these materials
wanna
because they
digitize
have
it.
historical interest.
Okay, if it's not digitized, I see.
If we can't digitize it and put it on the internet
have the
without
right.
permission, and it has to go document by document. So if you want to digitize a phone which might include 5,000 documents, you have to go document by document to get.
So if I understand it, your archives, the people you represent, have Crown copyright documents.
Most archives in Canada do.
They will have this
Crown
Crown copyright documents, and they will be physical documents, a book, say.
Right. So it could be a letter from an MP.
A letter
to
from an
a-
MP, so,
to a-
and someone wants to see it, they have the right to show up and say, show it to me.
Yeah.
But you don't have the right to copy it and put it out
That's
there. And even if you want to copy and put it out there, you have to physically go for every piece to get it.
Yes. And if the researcher wants to use the material, they have to get permission from the department.
Each department too, it's not even centralized.
Exactly. It's no
So
longer
you see, how do you
centralized.
see solving this? What do you see as a solution?
Well, first of all, I think there's no reason to have perpetual copyright anymore for Crown materials. Making it 50 years from the date of creation is a reasonable first accommodation.
That's the first step one.
Yeah, and I think that we then need to look at some of the there are some areas that are problematic, and I think we do need there have been many different studies, but I think we need a current look at the issues and, bring the stakeholders together and try to solve this problem, which definitely has solutions. Other jurisdictions have.
I'm sure my time's up, but I'm sure my colleague will continue on that front.
You were only over by 3 seconds.
That's
but
rare for me.
Thank you for being good about it. Monsieur Bernier, vous avez 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci.
Thank you.
My first question would be for Ms. Christine Peets. You said during your presentation that your income changed a lot. And can you explain a little bit more about that? And do you think that you're a specific case, or it happened with other also authors and creators in Canada?
Yes, it has happened with a number of our members, and I'm specifically referring to their access copyright payments.
Yeah.
They have reported that they have gone down significantly, in some cases as much as 50%. And this is due to the fact that they are losing the copyright to their works. They are being asked to sign over the copyright to particular works, and so they lose that copyright and they can no longer claim that work.
Okay. And should a Canadian author be able to reclaim their copyright before their death by terminating its transfer of licensing? Do you agree with that?
Yes. Again, the author should be able to determine where the copyright goes and to whom and for what period of time.
So you think that we must do a change in our legislation for being able to do that in Canada?
Currently, it's 50 years after the death of the author. Most of my colleagues felt that that was fair. I understand that there is some consideration to going to 70 years, which would be acceptable as well.
Okay, thank you. And for the Canadian Council of Archive, Ms. Nancy, you said about the digital lock that it's something that we may improve, or what is your...
The anti-circumvention rules came in with the 2012 amendments to the Act. And at the time, there were many requests to make exceptions for the anti-circumvention laws. In fact, there were very, very few exceptions that are in the law. And for sure, I remember testifying to a committee exactly like this for the 2012 Act, that there was a problem for archives not to be able to circumvent a digital lock in order to carry out essential preservation activities. And for us, that is the issue. It's something which we are allowed to do in the Act, but because it sometimes involves circumvention of a digital lock, we cannot carry out that essential function. So we are losing essential historical materials because we cannot circumvent in order to carry out an otherwise allowed act.
So you will ask for a change in our legislation for giving you an exception?
Yes, that if there is an allowable act in the Copyright Act, that we be allowed to do circumvention in order to perform it.
Okay, merci, thank you. I'm okay.
Okay. We're going to move to Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey, you have 7 minutes.
Start the clock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. One of the things I've been asking is witnesses about the Copyright Board. And what I'm concerned about is that we get this review done. This is all it is, a review. And then the minister's going to respond to the review. And then if there were some significant changes, it's most likely to come with a suggestion or a legislation which would require, in my opinion, more consultations, because we're just kind of getting, a little bit of feedback now on the change process, but nothing really specifically has been offered up at this time. But we could end up running out of time before the next electoral cycle. So is there anything that could be done in the short term through the regulatory process or through improving the Copyright Board decision-making process and enforcement process that would be beneficial at this time. I'm looking for those things that perhaps would be through the lens of a regulatory approach versus that of a legislative approach, because the regulatory approach is a matter of the minister's decision and discretion.
Would you want me to answer? The Copyright Board deals with published materials, and since archival materials, for the most part, are unpublished materials, our materials are not covered by the Copyright Board. So we don't have a lot to say about the Copyright Board. I know that the process has been criticized for being very long, very complicated. Certainly, we have issues around orphan works in archives. There have been some suggestions to include published materials as well as unpublished materials under the Copyright Board. I'm not sure that adding the burden of unpublished materials to the Copyright Board is the way to go for orphan works. I guess my answer is, at this point, in terms of archives, I don't have any concrete suggestions, except I wouldn't recommend adding unpublished materials to the Copyright Board mandate at this point.
And that's helpful. That's what we're looking for.
I think I would just add to that when it comes to published works, the Copyright Board does oversee those. And I think what you're suggesting of a regulatory process as opposed to a legislative process might be something that PWAC would definitely be interested in working with you and further consultation.
Yeah, because that's what I fear is that as we go down, we're hearing quite a bit of disruption and disturbance amongst the creative society. And I've also believed that when you change rules, if there are going to be people that are affected by it from government policy, amelioration should be part of that change. And this seems to me that there is a lot of artists that are and creators that are still trying to figure things out.
That's very true, and I think what we want to stress is that we do want to share our work, we want to have our work read and appreciated, and we want to be fairly compensated for that work. And in past reviews, perhaps things were skewed a bit more to the end user, and somewhere the creator got kind of lost in the shuffle. And we want to make sure that there is a balance, that the rights of the creator and the rights to the user are kept in check.
If nothing changes over the next 3 years, any crystal balling in terms of what is your greatest fear and
I think the greatest fear is that as more work does go from the print format to the electronic format, and therefore it can be shared much quicker and more widely, that the rights to that work is lost. People find things on the internet and they share them, and they don't necessarily take the time to figure out who wrote that in the first place and who does that belong to. And that kind of goes along and it snowballs. And I guess that would be my fear is, and I think I can speak for the writers and the others in our association, is that we want to make sure that our rights don't get lost in that shuffle.
Okay, so how much time do I have, Mr. Chair? I'm just going to indulge the Canadian Council of Archives just to thank you for the work. I know that sometimes you probably don't get the glory in archives, but a true story is that when on City Council, it was our municipal archives that led to the repatriation of the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel on the Canadian side to becoming back to the public. And this is significant because it was an archive document of the original agreement that put it in the private sector through a P3, where they didn't want to relinquish that. And by the time we received the tunnel back, it was ready to float down the river because the erosion on the top had been so gone. We couldn't find people to replicate the actual exhaust and fan system, and it required immediate millions of dollars. And to this day now, it plays significant revenue for the City of Windsor and is a critical piece of Canada's infrastructure. So I'll just conclude by saying thank you for you and your members who probably are not envisioned as the glory, but you have actually saved one of Canada's significant pieces of infrastructure.
Thank you. But that's what we do. That's what we're all about. It's about accountability and keeping the public record.
Thank you. And may I say, I've never seen this bridge of yours, but I have a clear vision in my mind because I've heard about it for the last 3 years. You're going to have to take us on a tour there.
Didn't know that story.
This is the tunnel. This one's about the tunnel, though.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
We're going to move to Mr. Lametti. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Wrong David. Wrong David. Sorry. Mr. Graham.
These naming conflicts, like in a computer file system. Are there any circumstances in which you believe the use of a technological protection measure should override other copyright rules or fair dealing exceptions?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. Yeah, so is there any time that you believe it's appropriate for a technological protection measure to override fair dealing? Should that ever happen?
I'm trying to imagine that situation. Fair dealing, no. I think really fair dealing should stand on its own, and I don't think TPMs should stand in the way of fair dealing.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Do you have any comments, Christine?
No, I don't. I don't understand the TPMs well enough to comment on that.
Fair enough.
You know, if it's allowable, if it's something that's allowable in the Act, a TPM should not prevent it from happening.
Thank you. That's exactly what I'm looking for. In the digital age, and it's so easy to register things now if we wanted to, does it still make sense for copyright to apply to everything automatically, or should we be thinking about copyright being on a proactive registration as it used to be?
Oh, I think it should be automatic.
It should be automatic?
Yeah, I think it's, yeah. That's pretty well an internationally accepted principle. I don't have a problem with that one at all.
Okay. Well, that's why I ask. And we talked a lot about 50 years after the creation, life plus 50. Is it appropriate for copyright to survive the life of the creator in the first place? And under what basis do we have this, in your view, system that copyright lasts longer than the person that created it?
I think, you know, the history of copyright, if you look at it, is a long one. It started out as a very short time period and has sort of creeped up. Archivists certainly believe that the period of protection as it stands now should not be extended. You know, people's work needs to be properly recompensed. Archives are a place where that balance in the act between creator and user is an everyday occurrence, because the people who deposit their materials into the archives are creators. The users come to use those materials. So we walk that line of balance every day. And I do believe that the term of protection, as it stands now as an international standard, is a fair one. Life plus 50. And that is the international standard.
It is the international standard. But if you were drawing your own rules, would it be 50 years, 25 years, or at death, that's the end of the copyright?
I don't think it's an unfair. That's a personal opinion.
That's fair.
I can't speak for all archivists about that.
Okay.
And I think with Creative Commons and the ability to actually waive your copyright, it's perfectly legitimate. If you want to make things openly accessible, it's very easy now to do so.
That's fair. And speaking of the Creative Commons and waiving copyright, I think it's a good segue into crown copyright, which is a topic that I find really fascinating, and a lot of people have never heard of. So, in the U.S., Section 105 of the Copyright Act prevents government-created material from being copyrighted.
It's absolutely open and free.
That's right. It's public domain.
Yeah.
Is that the correct model for Canada?
I think we have crown corporations, and I think there are some issues around crown corporations that need to be addressed. I think it's a little more complicated here. The British model is a little bit different than completely open. That's why I think we need a proper sit-down and investigation with stakeholders, looking at what the issues are and trying to come up with reasonable solutions. But for heaven's sake, let's do it.
Let's
and
do
stop
something.
talking about doing it.
So what in the British model should we emulate, in your opinion?
I think that there are different provisions. It's a little more nuanced than absolutely open copyright for everything. And I think that that nuance is more suitable for our environment.
Yeah. Have you had a lot of trouble with, well, have you ever had archivable material that you couldn't archive because of copyright rules that you would have liked to? And can you give examples to illustrate
the
it?
example that I gave is one of those situations where you have the thing physically in your hand. It's going to disappear because the CD is deteriorating, and there's nothing you can do legally to make it available for the long term. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I was a staffer the last time this topic came up, and I was working for the Critic at the time in the 2013 reform, and I remember learning at the time that the National Archives had apparently lost about 80% of the videotape of Parliament prior to 2005.
It's audiovisual materials are a big issue, and anything that's not in your hand that you can see is definitely problematic, and definitely the AV materials are an issue in terms of. But we have the right to reformat those audiovisual materials as long as it's not protected by a TPM. If it's under digital lock, we can't reformat. If it is, if it's not under digital lock, we already have the right in the Act to reformat it. Whether we have the funding to do that is another matter.
That makes sense. Are you familiar with archive.org?
Sorry?
Archive.org, the
Yes, of
Internet
course.
Archive. Yeah.
Yes.
Is offshoring of material to circumvent copyright happening a lot? Is that a method to protect materials?
I don't think so. I think that, not that I know of. I can't imagine how that would work. The international, the framework, the international framework with the international treaties are such that work is protected no matter where it is.
Right. Well,
The
American
rules are slightly different. But, if you go to the U.S., the terms of protection are life plus 70 rather than life plus 50. So you wouldn't be gaining much by going offshore, I can't imagine.
No, but they also have much looser fair use rules than our fair dealing rules. And if you
They're
look
different. But the reality is that when you're using copyright, it's the place where you are using the material that is the laws that apply.
Right.
So if you're using the material in Canada, you have to follow the rules in Canada, whether you access it from the U.S. or you access it from Canada. I can't see the way that would be an advantage. I really can't.
apparently my copyright's up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to Mr. Lloyd. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today. My first question is going to be for you, Ms. Morelli. You brought up the case of a good example of a CD, it's deteriorating, and you're saying that a change in the law to allow you to circumvent a TPM is the solution. Is there the technology out there to circumvent
Oh,
that
yes,
block?
absolutely.
So, and you've said that you're not able to speak to the owner of the copyright for what reason was that?
Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't reach them. Sometimes you don't know who they are. In this case, it was a group that came together and then dispersed.
So I think that's called an orphaned work, I think, right?
It's an orphan work, yes.
So would you say that, like, we could make a distinction between orphaned works and non-orphaned works? Like, should we be able to circumvent a TPM where the copyright holder is explicitly against the
It would be
circumvention of that?
one way to go, but the reality is, if you have the right to do it in the Act, what's the problem with saying you can do it without going through a whole rigmarole? We don't have to do anything for materials that are not under digital locks. Why is suddenly circumventing a digital lock an issue when you already have the right to perform the Act?
Okay, well, thank you for that. My next question is for Ms. Peets. This is more simple. I think it's straightforward. If copyright were better enforced, so more effectively enforced, and authors and publishers received the royalties that they believe that they're entitled to from educational institutions, would you see the need for a mandatory tariff in that case? Like if it was being dealt with effectively, enforcement was happening, people who were illegally copying works were being held accountable and paying for that, would you see the need for a mandatory tariff regime?
I think we still do need the tariffs. So we do need the universities, the libraries, the other institutions to pay their fees to access copyright, because that really is the only way. I think it would be too difficult to develop some sort of an enforcement procedure, and then who is going to do that enforcement and how is that going to be carried out and that type of thing. So I think if you just stick with the fees that are negotiated with each institution, then that is the easiest way to make sure that the publishers and the creators do get paid for their work.
But there's a significant amount of worry from the universities and the educational institutions that they're not really getting what they're paying for. You know, they're not getting the value for the money that they're paying for. And so it seems to me that there should be like a more transactional model so that they can actually buy and get what they're paying for. Don't you think that there needs to be a better way for universities?
Perhaps there needs to be a different model, but the universities at this point are claiming that they shouldn't have to pay a tariff for this material because it's being used for educational purposes and education should be free. Well, to that, I would answer that education isn't free. Students pay tuition, university professors are paid, support staff is paid. So
and I do
education
sympathize.
isn't free. And so why should the material that is created by the writers, why should that be free?
And I totally sympathize with the point you're making. We have had some testimony from the University of Calgary last week, you know, that they have attempted to pay for transactional licenses with access copyright, but that they were refused. They weren't allowed to do transactional licenses when they wanted to do that. And what would be your comment on that? Like the universities are trying, in some cases, not all universities, but in some cases, they are trying to get transactional licenses, but they're being refused. What's your comment on that?
I can't speak for access copyright.
Okay. And I guess, how much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
You got about 45 seconds.
Okay. If you could give me a quick comment, are authors being better protected in similar jurisdictions to Canada, for example, the European Union or the United States, and what do they do better for authors and publishers, or what do they do worse in your opinion?
Well, the United States, in New York State, they have just enacted legislation that is called Freelance Isn't Free.
Okay.
And so I think if Ontario, to start, and Canada, perhaps, to follow, could do something like that, then that would ensure that more authors are being paid for their work. And particularly when it's done on a freelance basis and not with staff writers with newspapers and magazines.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
We're going to move to Ms. Ng. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much for both of you to come and speak to us today. My first question is to Mr. Morelli, or Madam Morelli. Just to help me understand a little bit better, the users of the Archivist, researchers and so forth. And when we were talking about Crown copyright and that material, who would be the typical users who would want access, to that body, to those bodies of work?
It could be a family doing a family history and somebody looking at, pulling an example totally out of my head. Let's say the family of a chaplain in a prison was written a letter by the head of that prison because that chaplain was killed during a prison riot in the 1800s at some point. Well, that letter is still under perpetual protection because it was never published. But the family wants to write a family history and needs to publish it. And why shouldn't that letter be included in the materials that we can digitize anyway? If we're looking at prison riots and want to prepare documentation on our websites about that, there's no reason why that material should not be included.
Are there many I think about, the efforts these days of, getting greater Canadian content and sort of, and doing a lot of, support for, Canadian content creators. And, when I think about creators, I think about, young people. I think about those innovators. I think about the kind of, research or discovery or, or finding of works. And I'm thinking about, a way for them to access this material. And as we think about the Copyright Act and we think about how we might, need to look at it, what do we need to be thinking about in the future? So in other words, it goes something like, you've got this great body of work at, at the archives. We want to encourage more, not less,
We wanna
content
get it out
creators.
there.
We want it to get out there, and and with greater digitization and technology formats, it allows and lends itself for that, so that we can have another generation of great content creators in this country. So, so on that, just a slightly sort of different question. Data mining might actually come, as part of that type of work. I mean, some of you get content in a lot of different, in many ways, but some of it might actually be through data mining. So do you think that we should be looking at something like, like an exception that then allows for that kind of, sort of content scraping, if you will, or content mining, as a provision in the Copyright Act that then allows for a future-looking potential use?
Well, digitizing the materials in the first place is an issue, and we won't digitize material. You can't mine material which hasn't been digitized unless you're doing it by hand with index cards, which is, the old way of doing it. So we cannot think about digitizing materials unless we can actually make them accessible on our website. That's the kind of materials we actually digitize. So before we even get to the point of data mining, you have to be able to go through the digitization process. And we talk about orphan works in the brief which we're going to submit. I didn't talk about it today because we had a limited amount of time. But orphan works is definitely one of those issues. There are definitely barriers. And in the case of archives, most of the material in our institutions is not commercially viable material. It's material from families, it's material from individuals, from companies that don't have a commercial value in and of themselves. They have a historical value. So the barriers to doing the digitization in the first place are an issue before you even get to the data mining.
How much of the collection is digital?
Of
now?
our materials?
Yeah.
Oh, I would say less than 5%.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very little.
Okay. Thank you.
We have masses of material.
Right. Okay. On that point about about whether or not there's commercial value to it. I mean, I'm hoping that maybe in the future we do have some of those creators who actually might look through and in looking at how they might put that out there, could very well find a stream for. But that's another conversation.
We're working at digitizing
Yeah,
materials,
okay.
but archives don't have a lot of money.
Okay. Ms. Peets, just to pick up on a point that was raised a little earlier, I mean, we had also heard, actually, in fact, I think it was Montreal when we were there, we had heard from, from an organization that essentially is a platform. It's a platform that allows, if I understand, their technology that remunerates, authors based on usage down to a chapter type level, right? So when we talk about access copyright and sort of a tariff approach, and we've certainly heard from institutions that is a challenge because while you're right, education isn't free, you also want educational institutions to get the material that they want and to be able to get it and not have to pay sort of duplication, which is what we've heard from some of the testimony. So so in your view, I mean could something like that? I mean could something like that work, right? I mean you've got you have emerging platforms, and certainly we're seeing it in the music industry where there is an ability to be able to compensate on a more transactional and on a more targeted use basis. Can you comment on that?
I think you're talking about the pay-per-click model, and most of that is offered at such a low rate, like a penny per click kind of thing. So you've written a story, you've written a chapter of a book, and you'll get a penny for every person who reads it. Well, that could take a long time for you, you know, that means 100 people have to read it for you to make $1. So to do a transactional payment like that, it's very problematic.
So transactional from how it's remunerated now, but if it were remunerated in a fair way, the mode could work?
I suppose, but I think if you only have to look at what the models are now, and they certainly aren't. They are skewed towards the person putting the material on the platform, not the person who wrote the material.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me, thank you. We're going to move to the last question, would be Mr. Johari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll yield my time to MP Lamed.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you for coming. I'm an old copyright professor, so I am guilty of not having mentioned over 20 years of teaching, or rarely mentioned the reversionary right. So I'm as guilty as anyone else. Fair enough. He's
an old professor.
That's it. That's it.
You asked for it, David.
I'm guilty.
As long as we don't become relics.
Don't waste his time.
Ms. Peets, the challenge of the Robertson case, I remember teaching the Robertson case more than once and thinking, the good news is Heather Robertson won, the bad news is Heather Robertson won. Simply because, as you had said, and as I think we all predicted at the time, the publishers would just react by ensuring that every time they sign a contract with a freelancer, they would get all the rights. Mm-hmm. And that's even truer now, because when Heather Robertson wrote in 1995, the case was decided finally in 2006, but when she wrote the articles in 1995, we were talking about microfiche and putting them on articles on databases before linking and that kind of stuff on the internet was even in anyone's thought process. So help us find a solution, because it's not even a copyright problem, it's a contract problem.
It is a contract problem.
And it's an imbalance of power contract problem, because the publishers are always going to have, newspapers, whoever's buying the freelancer's work, are always going to have a great deal more power, and you've got to sell your work, and now they're going to want to be able to ensure that they don't get sued if something gets linked, or if they want to use it in some other format. So is there some model out there that can help us? Because I'm trying to get my head around it, and I'm not sure I can see. I'm sympathized with the problem, but I'm not sure where I see the solution.
Yeah, I can only speak to my personal experience on this, and it was always the large publishers who wanted all the rights. I never had that problem with a small publisher who you would think would want all the rights, and who would maybe make that demand even stronger than the larger publishers. And that to me was always, I don't know, an interesting paradox, because the people who, as you say, had all the power wanted even more power.
Right.
And the struggling publishers who would maybe putting out 1 or 2 magazines, they paid me reprint rights. They paid me if they wanted to put it on their website, that kind of thing.
Right.
So where the solution lies, I think you can look at that there is a balance that can be achieved. It's a question of will.
Right.
And do the publishers really want to have that? And I think if you can look at it that without strong content, they will not be able to sell their advertising. And so then they need to pay for that content.
Right. If your association finds any models or can think through a model, can you please
We will.
send it along and submit it?
We will take that to task. Thank you.
That would be great. Ms. Morelli, thank you for coming. There is an argument out there in academic circles, at the very least, that fair dealing provisions already apply to archives and other fair dealing uses as regards TPMs. Mm-hmm. Do you know if have you tried any of this?
The TPMs?
Have you tried any of this in court? That fair dealing applies to the TPM provisions.
That we should just go ahead and circumvent?
Well, I'm not saying that, but do you know of any cases that
How many archivists do you know who are really, really daring and willing to break the
I
law?
know at least one. I've just met one, apparently.
Yeah, maybe. Well, we do risk management for sure. And there are some instances when, just an archivist just quite honestly
Right.
can't let the thing go.
Yeah, you cross
because
yourself when you do
it's
it.
just
Yeah.
ridiculous. And the chances of you actually being taken to court over this are very low.
Right.
But we shouldn't be in that position.
Sure.
We really shouldn't be put in that position. We're allowed to do it under the provisions of the law. Why can't we just have an exception for circumventing TPMs? It's just not that complicated. I remember the process in 2012 so well. Everyone was absolutely fed up with the discussion. People were ready to kill each other at the end, and finally the government just said, no exceptions, period, that's it, that's all. We're not accepting anything. And everyone in the room knew and understood that, it was crazy for archives, but it just went through.
Okay.
It just slipped under the cracks.
You're done. Thank you very much. On that note, I want to extend our gratitude to our two witnesses today.
For having
And,
us.
It's been very informative, and we're looking forward to continuing our study. We are going to suspend for 2 minutes while we get everything in order and say goodbye to our witnesses, and then we'll come back. Thank you. And we're back. Okay, focus, 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 focus. Mr. Massey, I'll let you go. I just want to say that we do have some committee business that we need to get to. So, not that I want to limit any of this, but we were supposed to be in committee, so in camera. But if we can leave about 20 minutes, that enough? You think? Okay. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have a motion that I gave notice for at last meeting. I'd like to read the motion and bring to a vote for the committee. I'm just going to read it as a small motion, and then I'll speak briefly to it. I know that there's other potential motions here today, and I think it does speak for itself. But what I have tabled is that the Standing Committee of Industry hold hearings to study the proposed purchase by this government of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project pipeline and infrastructure, including A, the terms of the purchase, including the costs to taxpayers and long-term impacts of purchasing and completing this project. B, the direct and indirect impacts on Canadian businesses directly in competition with pipeline products and the use of those products in respective markets. And C, the plan for the sale of this project once completed. And if I could speak to the motion now that... Thank you, Mr. Chair. And essentially, I won't get into the full A, B, and C of the motion, but the general spirit of it and why I think it belongs here at Industry Committee is because the pipeline purchase and the potential expansion of the pipeline will have direct competitive implications on not only just the industry itself, being oil and natural resources, but also the subsequent markets the products then go to, especially given the fact that we now have public participation in those distribution of the product. And that's subsidization, potentially that could affect Canadian businesses. So say, for example, if the expansion of the project or the diversion of the products going through the pipeline go, say, for example, to China, and that is used to produce steel that then has had to be competed against Canadian industries, or other actually fueling components, then it's something that we need to have at least a discussion about and some witnesses on. There's a significant consequence with regards to the supply chain and the cost for consumers and the viability of different products in the market. And you have the outright industries itself in terms of how consumable oil and other energy products are used for the productions of goods and services. Then you have the actual then use and their competition of similar ones if they are publicly subsidized that you have to compete against. And so that's why I believe that this motion would be appropriate for us to have some hearings on. And I will conclude with keeping an open mind to our current studies, but hoping perhaps that if we can't get it done by the end of this session here, perhaps some meetings in the fall would be appropriate to have this, so we can provide at least a little bit of a lens of the consequences, positive or potentially negative or challenging. And again, it's about amelioration to markets and consumers and to competitors when there is government intervention in that respect.
Okay, Mr. General.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we on this side also fully support the motion put forward by Mr. Massey. I think what you're seeing right now is there's two parties here that are certainly willing to debate Trans Mountain and the impact that it'll have on the taxpayer. Certainly now that we all own it, and I think it's also important to note that there's $4.5 billion commitment by the government to this pipeline, but that does nothing to actually get the pipeline built. So I think it would be very informative, plus I think helpful to the government if we undertook a study here at the committee to look at the three things that Mr. Massey puts forward in his motion. Certainly would be supportive of this coming urgently. I'd even suggest that there would be some appetite on this side of the table to do it over the summer months too. I think that's how important this motion is. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Bayless?
Well, if I was going to support a motion, I'd have to support Mr. Massey's motion because it's clearly. Not that Mr. Jenner's motion is very well written too. They're both excellent motions. Yeah. In reality, this pipeline purchase falls under two ministers that are not the ISED minister. They fall under, obviously, Mr. Carr with Natural Resources, and they fall under Minister Morneau, Finance. It's not to belittle or say it's not an important issue, but it's not our issue any more than it's our issue to study agricultural matters. So in that sense, I would say that we would be against it, and it's not, and we're coming from the fact that we're against it strictly because it's not our minister that's involved. He hasn't been involved in any of the discussions on it. He hasn't been involved in any of the announcements on it. It really sits with the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Natural Resources. And if their committee, they're onto themselves what they choose to do or not, but that's where this should be done. And I would encourage you to speak to your colleagues on those two committees to push it forward.
Mr. General?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bayless, for allowing us to go back and forth a little bit here, at least I imagine, before a debate is adjourned at or voted against. Do respectfully disagree. I think that the comments saying this isn't our issue, I think it's every committee's issue, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of that's at stake. Particularly in the industry committee. We're a very integral and important committee in this parliament, if not one of the most important committees. And I think the industries that would be affected by this are certainly fall within the purview of the Minister of not only ISED but science and tourism as well. So I think all of those, and small business, thank you. I think all of those are reasons why this is something that we together as a committee should come and look at collectively. And the timing is, I think, urgent right now.
Any other speakers? Okay, then we shall call the vote. Recorded vote.
Mr. Shi.
Un vote par voie nominale.
Mrs. NG. No. Mr. Lloyd. Longfield. Oh, sorry, Mr. DeBerge.
Graham, no.
Mr. Jawari.
No.
Mr. Bayless.
No.
Mr. Massey.
Yes.
Mr. Lloyd.
Yes.
Mr. Généraux.
Yes.
Mr. Bernier.
Oui.
So there are 5 no's and 4 yes.
Okay, motion has been defeated. Mr. Lloyd.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I'd like to put a new motion on notice for consideration. I'd like to read it into the record. That the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology undertake a study of 4 meetings to review, among other things, the impact of U.S. imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum producers and the related supply chains, and that the committee report the findings back to the House and make recommendations on measures that could be taken to protect Canadian industry and its competitiveness.
Thank you very much.
I'll bring that up at the next meeting.
Yeah. Notice of motion has been received. Thank you very much. We will suspend for 2 minutes while we go into camera. 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
you.